this evening. I will be introducing them to you very shortly. We have some more people coming into the room. We're going to give them a minute while I talk to you a little bit about what's coming up next month. We have a webinar on February 16th with Joe Alvarez, and we will be putting the register link in the chat. So you can register for that starting now. And he will be here to talk about xeriscape gardening. We also have an exciting spring conference coming up on March 5th. It's Saturday. It's an all-day webinars, 4 webinars on Saturday, March 5th, starting with Douglas Ptolemy, Jay Kelly, Don Torino of the Bergen County Audubon Society, and Rebecca McMacken from Brooklyn Bridge Park. So that's going to be an exciting day. We will also put that link in the chat and you can register for that starting now. Very excited tonight to have our guests here. We have Bobbie Herbs. She is a master gardener. She's a certified Rutgers University Master Gardener, and she earned her Ornamental Horticultural Certification at Longwood Gardens. She is on the board of the Native Plant Society of New Jersey, and her backyard garden is in suburbia. So it is a small garden that attracts skippers, butterflies, frogs, toads, dragonflies, and even a box turtle. She's honored to make a healthier earth, and she's going to be here tonight and offer all of us a little bit of hope on how we can recreate our own wildlife habitats in our backyard. Along with Bobbie is Dr. Randi Eckel. She's been working with native plants for over 35 years, and she founded the very popular mail order native plant nursery, Toadshade Wildflower Farm, in 1996. She is a lifelong naturalist, lover of nature. She is the entomologist of the Native Plant Society, and she specializes in the interactions between plants and other living things. And she's known for her lively and engaging workshops and conversations. Not to put her on the spot tonight, but I think that I know that Randi and Bobbie are excited to get going. So I just want to tell you a little bit about their talk. Backyard transformation in just 3 years, recreating nature. Starting with the blank slate in 2018, Bobbie Herbs created a compact native plant garden in her backyard, nestled in a dense suburbia location. She hoped to bring a little wild into her yard. So she will walk us through tonight all of the steps, all of the research, the design, the execution. And then Bobbie and Randi are going to discuss what worked, what didn't work, and how Mother Nature had her own ideas about some of it. So I don't want to make you wait any longer. I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Randi Eckel and Bobbie Herbs.
Thank you, Kim, so much. Let's just dig right in here. What Randi and I are hoping is that you're going to take away some insights and tips on how to create something out of nothing. I'm going to go down the amateur's effort and what I did, where it started, and how the plan developed. And then, Randi, what are you going to do to help me out with this?
It's been really interesting. Bobbie came up with this idea back in June, and I'd never seen her garden. We'd never discussed her garden. She said, wouldn't this be a fun thing to put together? I was like, sure, what a great idea. So what I'm going to be doing is helping her work through some of the problems that she had and compliment her greatly on, if nothing else, doing a fabulous job of documenting what she's done over the last couple of years, which is just terrific. But it's a beautiful garden, and I think you're all going to learn a lot while we talk about where she started, where she got to, how she got there, and some things that happened along the way.
So here is the garden in June of 20. 20EER. There's a little bunny there, and I don't mind. He can come and go, or she can come and go with all her little family members. But what you see is that things can actually grow and expand in a very short time. The black-eyed Susans that you see here, some of which are not really black-eyed, but these came from 3 plants and they've seeded all over the place. I have hydrangea because it reminds me of my grandmother's hydrangea in her front yard. So I've chosen arborescens, but I chose the Annabelle cultivar. And I know a lot of you are purists, and I don't want to offend you, but I've got a mixed garden of straight species and cultivars because, as you can see, I live in very dense suburbia. I own 0.2 acres, most of which is house, and I really need to feel like I can influence people and not offend people relative to my creating a native plantscape. So back to the cultivars, because I think this is really important to kind of level set for the straight species people and people who are interested in using cultivars.
So yeah, Bobbie wanted me to talk just a few moments about the cultivars. And Bobbie, what was the name of that black-eyed Susan again? That's
Indian summer.
Indian summer. That's it. So Indian summer. When we create cultivars, we as a people, we select plants for our own thoughts, our own needs, our own aesthetics, really in mind. Really, when we're looking for cultivars, we're not thinking about recreating an ecosystem in our garden. We're looking for a pretty plant. Now, Indian summer is not a sterile cultivar. It's perfectly happy to cross and back cross with itself, which is exactly what has happened here in Bobbie's garden. There are tons and tons of cultivars that have been developed from Rudbeckia hirta, which is a wild species. And so what has happened by crossing and back crossing, a fertile cultivar, it's seeded all over Bobbie's garden, and she's got all kinds of different color forms showing, and we'll see some more of those later on. Now, Hydrangea arborescens cultivar, this Annabelle here that we're looking at, this is a perfect example of something that was really selected with our thoughts in mind and not so much the mind of looking at wildlife that might use it. The picture below, that is a straight species, Hydrangea arborescens, and you see there's larger flowers around the outside and tiny little flowers on the inside. But the tiny flowers are the fertile flowers. Those are the flowers that have nectar and pollen. Those are the flowers that produce seeds. The big flowers around the outside, those are sterile flowers. And you can see in Annabelle, to make it showier, we selected a cultivar with all large flowers, which is lovely, except for if you're a bee or a butterfly or looking for nectar or pollen, you're not going to find any on Annabelle. It's a sterile cultivar. It's a beautiful plant. We just need to remember when we're looking at cultivars, many times if we're trying to recreate ecological services in our garden, trying to find something that's closer to the wild type is going to serve that purpose better. And sterile cultivars, there's going to be no nectar, no pollen, and the seed eaters are going to be really sad because there's going to be no seed. But that's just one example when we're talking about cultivars, but there's going to be some cultivars scattered through here, and we'll talk about a few of them, but we just wanted to sort of get that out of the way right at the beginning. I think you wanted to move on to the next one. There we go.
Yeah. So my question to Randi was, will this house sell with the arborvitae, the azaleas, the mums? It was fall. Yes, we were looking. This was on realtor.com, and this is the house we bought. But talk to me about the plants a little bit, because I did some crazy things that may or may not be working, but you'll see that next. But talk to me about this, Randi. Tell me what I did and didn't do.
So this is classic. This is classic suburban landscaping. This is, in fact, when you put a house on the market, this is what the realtors will tell you to put in. These are almost entirely non-native plants, which means they don't support the environment at all. Our insects, our birds, our bees, our butterflies, they've all co-evolved with the native plants in North America. And they really can't use these European plants or these Asian plants at all. So we create these sterile landscapes that look very fine, but they look just like the next door neighbors. which can be a good or a bad thing, but we create this vicious circle where, well, this is what the neighbor's property looks like, so this is what my property needs to look like, and this is what the realtor tells me my property needs to look like. So those are the plants that the large nurseries carry. So even if you go to try to find something different, it's all the same plants. But that doesn't mean that you can't create a beautiful, stunning, very acceptable to your neighbors landscape using more natives. Here we go, Bobbie. This is what Bobbie did.
So this is what we did. We put some Ilex verticillata, which is, I'm trying to find my cursor here, in the corners where the arborvitae was. We put tiny wine, which is a 9 bark, which this is, I think this last fall. So it's starting to fill in quite a bit. I need to do some pruning. I've got caramel heuchera here, which is an interesting story that I'd love Randi to talk a little bit about before. And then sprinkled in here is more red with the Husker red beard tongue, which is everywhere. You'll see it in the backyard, which is really where the focus is going to be. But I just wanted Randi to make a couple comments about Husker red and coral bells, which I didn't know until we started to plan this.
Oh, the caramel. The caramel is a chance cultivar that simply showed up in it was actually retired nursery folk in France, I believe it is, but they were still breeding in their backyard because it's what plant people do. And they got this chance cultivar. They don't even know who the parents are. They think one of them is Heuchera villosa apricot, which is a cultivar of a southern US species. And they have no idea who the other parent was, but that's where that one came from. And Husker red is a fairly old cultivar from out in Nebraska. It was developed at the University of Nebraska, but I had always heard, it's one of the first cultivars I heard of a native actually. I had always heard that it was developed because someone found this lovely plant just growing in the wild that had this nice burgundy color to it. And they brought it in and developed into a cultivar. So some cultivars are quite the chance finds, whether they're in nurseries and backyards or out in a field in the middle of Nebraska someplace.
And the Husker red is actually fertile in my yard too. So
Yes.
I've got little tiny nurseries of Husker red that's seeded all around it. So I'm expecting some variation similar to what you described with the Indian summer, the Rudbeckia hirta.
Absolutely.
So the tip of the spear for me is Doug Talame. And when I quit my corporate job and started to dig into the horticulture and botany and all that, I immediately signed up for a Master Gardener program. And they had 1 hour dedicated amongst the 12 weeks of programs, 1 hour dedicated to native plants. And I fell in love. Talame was at the heart of it. His book is here behind me. If you could get close, you'd see it, the corners are turned over. There's pieces of paper stuck in there. There's highlighting all throughout. I was enamored. And I was enamored because I grew up here in Burlington and Camden County, and I saw them throw the house seeds all over. I saw all of the cattle farms and the agricultural farms all turn into housing developments. So to me, this kind of rough touch that humans make on the earth, and the fact that native plants could help restore some of that resonated with me. And this quote, I think, is just a beautiful one. It's so short and sweet that gardens used to just have to be pretty. It didn't matter if they were sterile, the same, never changing. They just had to be pretty. But now that we've touched so much of the earth, so much of America, it's important that they offer those ecological services, that they sequester carbon, that they filter and refresh water and air and be the pollinators. You know, it's like, there's some studies, I think that it's every third or fourth bite of food that you have is thank God to the bees, the native bees and the cultivated bees, because that's who's pollinating it. So I can have my apple or my plum or my pear. So it's really important, I think, that we grasp this idea of the significance of even in one yard, making it as native as possible in supporting ecological services and the natural systems. This is from Bloomberg, and I've got a couple shots here that Randi and I are going to go back and forth on, and then we're going to get into the garden. As you see here, this is the United States, the lower 48. The pink areas are the urban areas, and those pink areas are dispersed across the country everywhere you would expect them to be, but they are the fastest growing areas in the whole country. And why we're sharing this is because I think we both feel like this actually gives us, knowing that this area is growing so quickly and that we live here and we've touched this and we've changed it, gives us kind of a responsibility to recreate nature. And then there's the next slide kind of oversimplifies it a little bit, but I think Randi thought it was important that we show this, even though the urban areas are just 4%, they're the fastest growing areas.
Yeah, I mean, it boggles the mind that the urban area is increasing so quickly, and we can't simply, and this is a point that Talamy makes. Doug makes this point that we can't simply assume that nature is going to happen elsewhere. We have a responsibility, if nothing else, to keep things functioning. And we look at this again. This is Bloomberg, and if anybody who's really compulsive in there in the audience, if you add up this percent, it comes up to 101%. Talk to Bloomberg; they're not our numbers, but regardless,
decimals.
This tells you what the different parts of the country primarily is at this point. And the idea that even when you take Maine into consideration, that most of the Northeast is now considered urban, that's sort of a terrifying thing. Particularly, perhaps it's terrifying to you and me, but so much more so if you're a bee or a butterfly or a bird that's trying to find some place to nest and live. I think there's another slide now that talks about, there we go.
So 1.4 billion acres, 1.4 billion, or 60%, and it's the tan, not the multicolors, the pretty little earth tones. That is all owned privately. So I would take it a step further that it's not just a responsibility, since private enterprise, private residents own most of the lower 48. We also have an obligation to recreate nature in the best way we can. And I think, Randi, you brought up some points about who owns this and what they could do, from industrial campuses to business campuses and so forth.
And how we might influence that. It's a bit beyond your own backyard. It's where you vacation. It's where you shop. It's what trees your shade commission chooses to put in as street side trees. It's what we do with our open space and what we plant. And it's really on all of us. This is an obligation for all of us to really look at this a little bit harder and think a little bit more about the plants that are taking up that space and what are they doing for the environment in that area, other than simply taking up space. They need to do something more than that.
So to that point, I've listed here all of my influences. Their books are here behind me. I don't think you can read them. I'm not a television news set thing, gets it all set up just perfectly. But Doug Talamy, who's the tip of the spear for me, his sometimes collaborator, Rick Dark, who's also at the University of Delaware, a brilliant ecologist, naturalist, and a photographer, really great photographer. Matter of fact, I took a class with him and he taught me some tricks for the iPhone. Pete O'Dolph, who he's also worked with, and Pete O'Dolph of the Highlands fame, Detroit Gardens fame. He also worked with Rick Dark. Two people I met through the Native Plant Society, Desiree Narango, and I know Randi has some references to her work, so I'm not going to go into that. Larry Wiener's Delaware Valley guy, and he's done quite a bit of large scale native plant. What I love about him is he admits his mistakes, or he admits, oh my God, I didn't know nature was going to do that. How can I solve it? Then we have the Fido Studios crew, Claudia West and Thomas Rayner. They have some great videos online, and they are all about small yards, large yards, hell strips. They're all about putting nature everywhere. And I think that one of the quotes that I like the best from Thomas is that in the future, gardens will look like nature. And I think that is really cool. And then the strangest one of all, Gilles Clement. He actually did this garden in a submarine base in France. He's actually a musician, an author, an artist. He's a jack of all trades, but he dabbles in landscape. And I think he really kind of sums it up the most, is that even where humans have disturbed land, nature is still at work. So just like Peter Doff, who studied the plants that were there in the High Line before they started to develop their plans, their landscape plans, he did the same thing here at the submarine base. He looked to see what's there and what fits in that community, and how can I recreate that and make it absolutely gorgeous, which I hope you love this as much as I do. So now we're into my garden. So there we go. We're going to set up why I think the way I think, why I did the crazy stuff I did, and why I was so surprised, and Randi set me straight. So my objective was to have a fuss-free, may not be as fuss-free as I wanted, nature-filled oasis, abuzz with life. I swapped turf for some wild in my yard. I used native plants, and I was really keen on living mulch. I didn't want to see any wood chip mulch after the first year. And I also practiced sustainability across the board. So the turf that was dug up to do the hardscape was sandwiched like peanut butter and jelly, grass on grass, and that created some beautiful mulching effect there, which provided some nutrients for the soil. There's no watering, no chemicals. We turned off the sprinkler system. So we are about as sustainable as possible, and we're managing stormwater underneath the decking that you'll see in a minute. So here we are, there on the left. That's what we started with. Crazy me. Privacy fence up to 6 feet, a deck and some stairs onto a cement pad. It's 800 square feet, and when I walked down to the edge and off that cement, the water went up around my sneakers, and it was squish, squish, squish everywhere in that 800 square feet. Matter of fact, we had to get homeowner association permission to do what we did. And we also had to get township zoning board permission to do what we did. And when we were standing there, like scared, like we were on trial in front of the zoning board, and the zoning board said, we went and walked around your yard and it's nothing but sponge and water, and I don't know how you're going to do anything back there. And I said, that's why we're doing something back there, because we're going to make sure the water's still moving, to make sure that we're using that water to our best ability, and we're creating a space that we can enjoy out back. Randi's on a zoning board, so she may have something that she wants to add, but I know she wants to talk about what the heck do you do with a blank slate? I'm one of those people that can see all sorts of crazy things, but I've got tons of friends who say, oh my God, I have no idea what to do.
So first of all, don't be afraid of your planning board and your zoning officer. They're lovely folks. I just have to put in that, I have to put in that plug for zoning. They're there to make life good. But anyhow, people are, when they're faced with walls or straight lines, whether it's the edge of the property, that fence, by the way, in Bobbie's backyard, that goes right along the edge of the property line. That wasn't part of her backyard that was fenced. That is the entirety of her backyard that is fenced. So with or without the fence, Bobbie was going to be dealing with a straight line. And people look at straight lines and they have no idea what to do. You know, the first reaction of a lot of folks is they line them up against the wall. It's the firing squad approach of planting a garden. This rarely looks good. This happens to be down in Cape May Courthouse. I actually think that this gentleman wedged the plants in at the foundation line, and they're all sort of leaning over trying to find some place to grow. A couple things. One, plants will grow. Whenever you plant a plant, remember it's going to grow and get bigger. But straight lines are very formal. They have a place, they can be used in a formal setting, but they tend to be, well, they're unnatural. They are forcing nature into something that is very strict. So really a great design trick is to use your garden hose. Learned this trick a long time ago, but create undulating lines, curving lines. They're pleasing to the eye. They create a sense of motion, and you take your garden hose and you run it around, and it's a great way to play with design ideas. because you can lay out your garden with the garden hose and be like, I want to change it a little bit before you ever get started with it. But really, undulating lines, curving lines, they're much more pleasing to the eye. And even in the middle of the winter when nothing's growing, they still create a sense of motion, which is terrific. So did she keep the fence? No, she did not keep the fence, because this is what was beyond the fence. This is, the grass here is maintained by the homeowners association, but that is not free for Bobbie to landscape that area. And beyond is this very, very wet woods. You can see the puddle there. It's primarily cedar, sweet gum. I believe you said there's a little bit of American holly in there. Definitely some stilt grass in there, which is a weed, Japanese stilt grass. But I do want you to note, and this is a little bit of a foreshadowing for things to come. Notice that there's nothing growing for about the first 5 feet. The cedars are trimmed up 5 feet. There's very little growing on the base of the forest floor there. And this might have given a little hint to what might be coming when the deer discovered Bobbie's new garden, but we'll talk about that as we move on. But Bobbie, show us what you did.
So here it was in late 2018 when we moved in. I invited my handy person sister over and her husband. They brought their Sawzall. We cut down all of the privacy fence. It was a chore. And we found a place to recycle it in Columbus. So we threw it in the pickup truck and took it off to them. They wouldn't help us unload, so we actually had to unload it up there as well. But that's okay. They took it and I was happy about that. In 2019, this was actually a warm winter. So we got started in like around March 1st. This is probably in April. You can see how we took the turf out, the hardscapes in, the knee walls in, and we just turned that turf over. I know Randi was like, was it like a raised bed? I'm like, no, we just took all of that turf where the hardscape is and flipped it over. And then we laid out the plants. Now this corner is where the Pinus strobus is, our white pine that's probably been there for several years. So that's kind of an anchoring point for you when you think about it. And then in 2021, this is after the redbud has leafed out. Everything's leafed out here, but other things aren't blooming yet. The pine tree is back and over here. So you can see the dramatic difference in just 2 seasons. I mean, even for herbs and forbs, I mean, usually 3 years is maturity, but you know, we've got a verdant backyard in late May, even in 2 years. So the research I did was I did my soil test. Being a master gardener, I know how to get to the cooperative extension. I know how to do the soil test without causing a lot of cost relative to mailing the soil to extension to Rutgers. I did a drainage test and I was joking with Randi because I started digging my 10-inch hole and ran into water. So I quickly said, I'm close to the water table here. I think I'll just watch that pond in the back and see how long that takes to drain. And then I did a sun study immediately so I could figure out how much sun I had in the backyard. And what I learned was that I had part sun with a shady area near the white pine, that my drainage was slow, but it did take time and the soil was pretty moist. It was also acidic, but not quite Pine Barrens acidic. And it was sandy loam with marl. Like, I don't live in Marlton, I live in Mount Laurel, but Marl doesn't know the boundaries of the township. So it's where I am too, and partially why the water drains so slowly. And we have an abundance of deer, lots of deer pressure. So I really chose wisely the first year. Can't say I've done as good after, but the first year to pick some deer resistant plants. So here's my design. I could have hand drawn it. I took the class at Longwood, had a beautiful, beautiful drawing of what they asked, but no, not me. PowerPoint's my thing. And so I did all the scaling and conversions of whatever those scales are on PowerPoint into feet. And so this was it's actually part of like a 30-page PowerPoint of, I did curvilineature, which is what we ended up with. I did rectilinear. I did just some crazy stuff, but we picked the one that we thought would be most natural. Kind of to Randi's point, just put the garden hose out there and you'll see how it should be. I can't go past the straight lines. the HOA will stop me there because we're onto their property. So I had the straight lines as the edges of the garden. You're not expected to read this, but there's going to be a handout that'll be posted on npsnj.org of all of the plants in my garden, in my yard, all around the yard, not just the backyard. And you'll see everything from nativity to ecological benefits and so forth. So you've got a lot of data here you can play with. I also keep a journal. So I want to know what's happening with all my plants from when they begin to grow up. And now there's so many there and they're so well established. I actually have ground cover even this time of year. So I'm going to start writing down what's giving me ground cover, like my tiarella and my lobelia, and what isn't. So it's just a great record of how plants behave, which is something I could learn a lot about. So here it is. And I highlighted the plants that brought me to tears. I planted a ton of goat's beard. I love goat's beard. It was already in the garden where I lived before here. I thought, oh, I've got part shade. This is awesome. I can put males in, females, because it's dioecious. I can put my cinnamon fern out there, which will be really pretty. And we're going to find out what happened. They were a fail. It didn't work. I had a little too much sun there. Also, my dogwood passed away in the first year, which was very disheartening. It looks kind of fine here, but it didn't make it either. So what we're going to do here is go through vignettes. So I've broken the garden out. Like Randi said at the very beginning, she's never been here. She had a hard time getting oriented. So this was actually her idea for helping you get oriented during the presentation. So we've got my white pine over here, and we're going to break it out into 5 vignettes circling around the yard. Every plant that we're going to talk about is listed at the beginning of the vignette. And then we have the portion of the design here. And then we're going to get into what's happening. So this was soon after it was planted. It was June of 2019. I'm very happy because the hydrangea is blooming. My viburnum back here is blooming. You can see my Ilex glabra, which you don't see except for wintertime. And over here, count them. 1, 2, 3. Rebecca Herta, 3. That's what I started with from the county gardens. So I put some plugs in for Zizia aria because I wanted something more than pots of parsley and fennel for my my black swallowtails. And so Zizia aria is a native plant that is a host. And that grew up and looks like it's mature after 1 year. And it's awesome. It does have some problems with deer. Deer do find it a little nibbly. I also put in some phlox subulata because I needed something to come and cover that the chips, as well as begin to cover and soften the edge of the hardscape. Anything you want to say, Randi, about the little deer and my Zizia, or do you want to save that?
Well, I think we'll get to the deer pretty soon, but sometimes, you'll have deer that simply nibble on things, and sometimes they actually prune your plants rather nicely for you. Blue wood aster is a great example, but sometimes they can get a little overzealous, and we will touch on that in a little bit. But yes, Zizia is somewhat deer resistant, but that doesn't mean that the deer leave it alone.
Yeah, cool. So here's a shot of the hydrangea this year in June. It is absolutely gorgeous. It reminds me of my grandmother. I have some lavender here, non-native, but it's indicated here. And you can see some Rebecca Herta. I think what's interesting is how quickly the viburnum has grown. Right now, the stems are 6 feet high. You'll also find my Iris versicolor is here and very large. It's 4 feet plus at the beginning of the year. It gets even larger before it blooms. But I know, Randi, there's some things about Desiree Narango here and having enough straight species in your garden that it actually supports wildlife and bird populations, right? She studies chickadees.
Exactly. She did some work with Doug Talmy and with Smithsonian. She did her research in Washington, D.C., very urban environment, and was looking at what percentage of plants on your property you need to have be native species to be able to actually support a single nest of chickadees. Chickadees are not very big birds, but they feed their young caterpillars, and they feed their young an enormous number of caterpillars, hundreds of caterpillars a day, thousands of caterpillars. I think it's something like 7,000 to 9,000 caterpillars,
Yep.
simply to feed a single nest of chickadees. And what they found was that the biomass, the amount of vegetation on your property, at least bare minimum, 70% of it needs to be native plants to be able to support a single nest of chickadees. So that doesn't mean that we're expecting your plants are not going to get chewed to death by caterpillars. Native caterpillars spend most of their time hiding because they don't want to be bird food. That's what they do. So since really, 70% is the absolute minimum, 80 is probably a much better goal. But that means you can put in the lavender that reminds you of, well, this was a gift. This was a gift to you. You can put in the lilac tree that was a gift from my mother-in-law. I don't feel guilty about that because I have so many native plants on my property and so many native trees on my property. I have a lot, I'm producing plenty of caterpillars for the birds, trust me. But as long as you're not putting in invasive species that are going to seed in and cause trouble in the surrounding environment and keep spreading and wreak havoc, you can have pockets of these plants that are your family's heirloom rose that belonged to your great grandmother, or the peony that was handed down to you. That's okay. You can work that into these beautiful native landscapes, and they look right at home mixed in with them. It's a beautiful combination.
So we're going to move on to vignette number 2, which is the knee wall and the red bud. The red here in the design was supposed to be cardinal flower, but I switched to blue lobelia, I think because I wanted some cooler shades for summer, late summer, when it's just so hot, and kind of reminding me of cool weather. You can see here on the left-hand side, these are 2 years apart. I did have the blue lobelia here in the front near the lamps. I have my columbine in front of that, which is done, the fathagia, as well as my clethra. This blue lobelia is so happy here. It was almost 4 feet tall. So that had to move because I couldn't have it budding right up next to me as I was trying to enjoy the garden. So it has been moved around the yard. It also, because it's a straight species, seeds around my yard. It has a lot of fun here. But I replaced it with Tiarella over here on the right-hand side, which is both straight species and Timbuktu, because I love the shape of the Timbuktu and the coloring of it. I did both here. This is 2 pictures from 2021. I just wanted to show you the red bud in bloom. And this tree is now so tall, I can see it out of my 2nd story window. It's growing fabulously. It's very happy. And it'll someday produce enough shade for me, because we're going to get to that. Over on the right, I wish this picture could really capture how beautiful the bottle brush blooms on the fathagia worked with the beautiful Tiarella white blooms. I really wish you could see how beautiful it is. And then the contrast of the wild columbine. But it's very hard to capture, and you'll see I've tried it in many ways. So we're gonna get right to this. So I planted part shade and shade plants, right? Because I did my sun study when the shadows were the longest in the season, December. And Randi, oh my gosh, I feel so silly. I feel like a master gardener. I went to Longwood. I should know better.
But people do this all the time because this is when often we spend a lot of time planting our gardens. A lot of gardeners, they sit down, they have their hot cup of tea, they got the fire roaring, they're planning away their garden, and you look out the window and my God, it looks pretty shady this time of year, particularly if you're new in an area. If you had been in this space for 5 or 10 years and suddenly decided to put a garden in, you would have known, but you were new to this property. And it's a very, very common error that is made, and no one should, we all should feel a little bit silly about it, but we've all done this mistake. I have a driveway that is in shade all winter. So the ice persists all winter, and then come summer, it's just blazing hot and dry. Really an excellent combination in all ways. But regardless, not only are the shadows shortest in June, that's when the sun is the most intense. So when you put in shade-loving plants and then you get this intense sun, the results can be a bit intense.
Like this. My scorched foam flower. Oh my goodness. You can see little Timbuktu down here saying, oh my God, please shelter me from this. We have my goat's beard, which I tried for 2 years, like maybe, just maybe it'll be okay. Finally moved that. And actually in year 1, oh, look how crispy that.
Even with all the moisture that you have in your gardens, even with all that moisture, you still had a scorched cinnamon fern. What month was this, Bobbie?
This was June. It was June.
Yeah.
Yeah, it just started. So I moved all those things except for the tiarella. So Randi, help me with what I did wrong, what I should do next time.
Well, it might have been, well, first of all, you know what you did wrong. You did your sun study at the wrong time of year. But people also make this mistake when they put in things planning for the ultimate size of a plant and forgetting that plants take time to grow. You know, I mean, Bobbie's, your red bud's now getting some size on it, but it's still not casting a lot of shade in your garden. Eventually it will, and maybe in that section of the garden, Bobbie can put back in the tiarellas, put back in some of these plants that she loves so much once she has a little shade to help them. Another thing that you can do is, thinking forward, choose plants that might be able to create a little bit of shade for you. Up in the far right-hand corner here is Bobbie's dwarf Fothergilla, which is never going to get big. That's why it's a dwarf Fothergilla. Fothergilla gardeniae just doesn't get to be that large. But Fothergilla major, also known as large witch alder, this is a photo found from the Mount Cuba Center in Delaware. It's a beautiful tall shrub which will create its own shade. So sometimes in gardens, we need to stage our planting, knowing that if we're putting in a young redbud tree, it's not going to create a lot of shade that first year. And maybe we want to put off planting those shade-loving species underneath it until it starts to get a little bit more mature. You know, sometimes people do it in exactly the opposite direction, Bobbie. They put in the redbud and all their favorite sun-loving plants, and then suddenly the redbud gets big and they get disappointed that their sun-loving species have all died. So we need to think about how plants grow and how long it's going to take them to mature and what they're going to look like and what kind of shade they're going to cast when they do mature.
Right. So here's Vignette 3. This one, I just going to share some of the deer-loving plants that I have planted here. My trillium, my straight species, Geranium maculatum. The trillium didn't come up till the second year, so I was so thrilled when I saw those leaves breaking through this year. I have a cultivar of a geranium that I thought was a cultivar of the American species, and it's not. And I also put phlox in where the sun was pounding down. But the deer actually came in and ate all of those wonderful, beautiful plants. You can see here, my fringe tree is still doing fine. My penstemon, which is with the seed heads now, is doing fine. But oh God, how painful that was. So deer, other than putting the fence in, which I did, what are some of the alternatives I could have thought about?
I put Bobbie's little before and after picture on the right-hand side here, so you guys can really feel her pain really up and close. How she was enjoying flowers one day and the next day they were gone.
And the scent.
So there's a few things that we can do. You know, my jokey answer, which is only partial joke, is we need to eat more venison. But aside from that, there are a lot of deer resistant lists of native plants out there, and different sites post them, and people sometimes get frustrated because they plant a native plant that's supposed to be deer resistant, and well, it's not resistant to their deer. It doesn't mean that group was lying, or that your cousin Susan that gave you a deer-resistant native plant that your deer eat was lying. Different deer populations have different tastes. Sometimes, Bobbie may have deer that eat things that my deer don't eat, and vice versa. But there are some native plants that are particularly deer resistant. This is not an all-inclusive list, but this is a pretty good list. And I always top it with the beard tongues. Beard tongues at our nursery, we grow them outside the deer protection fence. The deer leave them alone. The deer get the pots stuck on their hooves, but they don't chew on them. Penstemons are very deer resistant. Aromatic mints are excellent. Deer hate mint. Wild bergamot, yucca, anemones, blue false indigo. A lot of our native grasses and sedges are extremely deer resistant. And sometimes you can use these in concert in mixing some very deer resistant plants with less deer resistant plants. Particularly the mints are great at this, so that you can sort of hide things in and amongst the deer resistant plants and keep the deer at bay. You can use blood meal fertilizer. It's a byproduct of the meat industry. It deters rabbits and deer reasonably well, and it doesn't really have a terribly noticeable smell to us, so it's not like it's going to make your garden smell terrible. But at the end of the day in New Jersey, what most of us wind up doing is putting up some sort of fencing. And you don't have to put up a stockade fence. Deer can jump over an 8-foot tall fence. But you can put up lovely fencing like this that Bobbie has. This is plastic deer fencing. But you can still see through it. You haven't hemmed yourself in. You haven't surrounded yourself by stockade fencing. She can still enjoy the view. And she and her husband were smart enough to remember to put in a gate, because that's one of the things people forget to do, is they put up the fencing, then suddenly they're like, I can't get out. So this is her garden in recovery that has recovered beautifully once she patched where the deer pushed through.
Yeah, we're going to talk about chopping your plants in a minute, but the deer helped me out with this, and for sure. I also want to share one of my favorite plants here, the Spigelia marylandica. The Indian pink grows up within this cultivar and not native geranium, because the geranium leaves a lot of air on the ground level, and this clumps. And I just love it. So I had to share this picture. June is one of my favorite times of year in the garden because of special plants like this. The fourth vignette, and this is the second to the last, was the fountain, which you can hear, I hope. Can you hear?
Yes, on and off. It's coming in and out.
Okay.
By adding water to a garden, you can attract so many birds to your garden. Birds will really come into that sound of trickling water. Go ahead, Bobbie, I interrupted you.
Oh, no, that's okay. So once again, my sister and brother-in-law, we all got together. They brought the tools, I brought the ideas, and created this fountain, which is now very much surrounded by plants. This is year one. And then you can see it here, surrounded by one of my favorite plants that I've destroyed over time, that I really want Randi to talk about, because this northern blue-eyed grass, this is a cultivar, lucerne. So it has a little bigger flowers you can see on the left, but oh my gosh, it was so pretty. And I was so impatient because I did not want the bark mulch. I did not want the wood chips. I wanted it to cover quickly. So Randi, if you can just kind of quickly talk a little bit about this and the shameful thing I did with that would be awesome.
Well, back up real quick. Hold on. Let's look at the blue-eyed grass. So blue-eyed grass is sort of a short-lived perennial. This would have seeded in, this would have filled in. And, Bobbie was concerned a little bit that it was didn't quite like it as wet as it was right next to the fountain there, but it would sort of self-pruned itself away from that. That have worked fine. One of the things that we forget to do a lot of times when we set out perennial gardens, we're so used to annuals, getting that immediate gratification. An annual grows to its full size in a single year, and perennials don't do that. We really need to give herbaceous perennials really at least 3 years to sort of get their maximum size and get their mature size. And we're all guilty of this. We get impatient and we're like, oh, it's not filling in enough. So, oh, I'll add in just something a little bit to help fill it in. Go ahead, Bobbie.
So this is what I did. I ordered Iris cristata, dwarf crested iris, that has, as Randi looked at my picture, she's like, is this really? So anyway, whatever iris this is, even though it's labeled what I purchased, may not be what I purchased. So beware, just something to think about. It took over, pushed out. You can see over in the right-hand picture how it's really crowding out the little blue-eyed grass. It's 10 to 12 inches tall. And I thought I had a picture of what it really should look like here, but maybe on here. There's what it should really
There it
look
is. Yeah, that's more typical. That's what dwarf crested iris usually has, these sort of floppy leaves with the flowers up at the top and not those tall stalks. So, I don't deal a lot in cultivars. So, I dug around trying to figure out what that short iris is that Bobbie might have. But to me, it simply doesn't look like Iris cristata. So I promised her some Iris cristata for this spring, so she can put some in for comparison. But regardless, it is even with the very somewhat overzealous iris in there, it is a beautiful spot in the garden.
It is, and we sit out there and have coffee, and it's wonderful. So the first year, Chelone glabra, which is very happy here because it likes the little wetness, the wet soil, grew to about 4 feet, maybe almost as tall as me, which is not what I wanted because it was here. It's also in the back of the garden, which is fine if it's tall, but it was here with the penstemon here at the edge of the garden. So I decided to experiment, and I chopped it probably 2/3 just to see what would happen. And you can see we have a beautiful plant, tons of flowers, just the right size. And next year, I'm going to be chopping this up here as well. Now, I called it Chelsea Chop, and Randi's like, yeah, if you were in England, probably, but the timing's different, whatever. So I know you have some thoughts. Like, this is fortunate that it worked for me. It was an experiment, so I'm happy it worked too.
It worked beautiful, and Chelsea Chop. It's a British term. It's for the Chelsea flower garden. You nip everything down in May, so it's the right size for the flower show. Different plants tolerate being cut back differently. Some don't tolerate it at all. Some think it's just the greatest thing, and you get all these extra flowers from it. Around here, I usually hear it referred to as jokingly between the holidays. So somewhere between Memorial Day and the 4th of July, you go in and you can pinch back, cut back some of your plants that may be getting a little bit too tall, a little bit too zealous, but you want to do it for plants that are going to branch, plants that will tolerate it. So it's good, as Bobbie did here, to experiment on that. And I'm not actually keeping an eye on the chat, but I did see somebody say, ha, 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 my dear, do it for me. Well, for some plants,
yeah.
For some plants, that's wonderful. I alluded to this earlier, but I have some beautiful plants, blue wood aster, which is Symphyotrichum cortifolium. And it's as if I've hired the deer to be my private gardeners and come in and carefully pinch it back, which they chew on it up right through about the end of July. And then I think it gets a little bit too woody for them and they stop chewing on it. It looks like I've had private gardeners pinching back my asters, and they look beautiful every year. So this is a method that you can use, but you do want to make sure that you choose the right species and maybe do a little experimenting, make sure it's going to work well for you.
So here's the fountain surrounded by my living mulch, my Packer Aria. I love it. And you can see the golden flowers, blooms for about a month in May. It's fragrant, it's wonderful, and it's thriving. So this year, I'm sure it'll be even more full. And I should take a picture of it in the winter because it is evergreen. So it constantly leaves a beautiful little padding there on the ground. And here's just the last shot of the fountain from this summer in August with my blue lobelia, which is seeded from the other side of the yard, my pink tick seed, my powwow echinacea, because I couldn't resist the hot pink, and it just standing out there. And then we're going to go to the last vignette. So the last vignette is the entrance on the other side of the house. My husband was kind enough to help me put together. Actually, I think he did the whole thing with the trellis. I should
give him credit.
Yeah, so we've got the Packer Aria, which you can see here in June of 2020, nothing on the trellis. I planted my coral honeysuckle on here, which actually has some berries left on it. And it had a bloom until early December, which astonished me. And then you can see here on the right-hand side is the aromatic aster, so the Symphyotrichum oblongifolium, and my Itea virginica, which is Henry's garnet, because I didn't want it to get too big. It is suckering, which I was thrilled about, because if it fills in that whole, the depth of that area, I'll be really happy. And it's so gorgeous with the lavender and the red of the foliage in the fall. So that's it for the vignettes. I did pay attention to layers in my design, and I thought it was important that Randi kind of reinforced some of the values of the layers. And then I'm going to show you a couple of things. And then we're going to be close to wrapping it up.
We are. This is a illustration from planning for a post-wild world, but it really illustrates the three main layers of a garden. We often plan for the structure and the seasonal layer, but often folks completely ignore that ground cover layer. And Bobbie used wood chip mulch exactly right. She used it as a tool for the first year and a half, just until her plants filled in. Big beds of wood chip mulch, that's not a garden. Wood chip mulch is dead stuff. There's nothing living there. Gardens are something that grow. So make sure that you plan for ground covers. You may want to pick some, I'll talk just a tiny bit about that later, something a little less zealous if you have all that water than golden ragwort, which is very happy at Bobbie's. But it's important to think about all those layers when you're planting. Go ahead, Bobbie.
And then some of the things we did here. So I was thinking layers for stormwater management, because we already have a wet backyard. And I wanted to make sure that I didn't have running water through this. I didn't want to have things gushing out of my gutters and across here. So that's why we managed the stormwater underneath the hardscape, but also by adding the layers. Water's trickling down slowly. It's much easier for water to seep into the ground and not run off if you have multiple layers. Now, granted, all my layers are not huge. You see my lovely fringe tree here. I have two more here. And I have to tell you, I was so excited because I didn't know if I had males or females in the place I bought them. They couldn't tell me if they were males or females, but this one had the big dark blueberry droops on it this year. So I'm so happy I've got a female, because that'll be beautiful over time. And that'll get to be 10, 15 feet tall, maybe 20 if it's really happy.
Yeah. And they're so fragrant.
And they'll build in broadly too, which will give me some shelter and privacy. On the other end of the garden is the viburnum nudum, which in this shot doesn't show how big it is and how lush it is, but that gives me a beautiful anchor in the corner there next to the white pine. So, and I actually replaced that poor dogwood with a magnolia little gem, which frankly, it's only been there a year. It looks better from my deck than it does from the ground right now, but it'll fill in and grow up over time. So here's a couple things I have on the ground layer that we really didn't get into. So here's where I moved my cinnamon fern, and you can see the fronds are growing up in the leftover, the skeletons from the year before, which I just think is so lovely. Asarum canadense, which is actually pollinated by beetles. So those little flowers, you have to dig underneath the leaves quite a bit to find them. But you have these little purple flowers there on the ground so the beetles can climb in and out. I've got Canadian white violet that's growing here. It's actually growing up in the front as well. And my Caltha palustris, which is starting to spread all under that area as well, because it blooms in spring and it's really happy there. So Randi, this is it. So what are the key takeaways, not just for me, but everybody who has joined us? I'm so thrilled that you're all here. The key takeaways, and then we're going to show you just a quick slideshow of some of the critters that come in the garden, but we can get ready for questions while that's playing.
So just a real quick review of some of the points that we made. Make sure you do your sun study during the growing season so that you can plan for your light properly. Think about viewscape and privacy. By taking down the fence, Bobbie lost a little of her privacy from side to side, but she's getting that back because she planted in some taller shrubs on the ends to help recreate that. Make sure you give your garden time to mature. Gardens require patience. Plants grow, they change over time. When it says en masse, that doesn't mean plant a million of them right next to each other. You'll save a lot of money if you plant them a little further apart and let them fill in. Let's see. The right plant. When you look at the descriptions of plants and it says it grows 3 to 5 feet tall or 3 to 7 feet tall, know that if you have the perfect conditions for that plant, you're going to get the 7 foot tall. If you have lots and lots of moisture, they're going to get really nice and tall. Bobbie I have a dry hillside. We live on top of a hill. Bobbie is blessed with the moisture that I don't have in her garden. So anything that could really took advantage of that moisture and got very large. And that's why her golden ragwort has spread quite so well. Remember that most perennials can be moved. If there's too much of a good thing, give it to a neighbor, give it to one of your friends that don't have interesting landscapes, or move it as she did with the cinnamon fern. Bad spot, pick it up and move it someplace else where it's going to be a little happier. Consider trimming things down. Almost all the wild asters do great with that, the phloxes, the chelone, and certainly there are others as well. And strive to have at least 70%, please, of native plants in your garden so that you can have a functioning ecosystem, you can have a functioning garden that supports wildlife. And I think those were the main takeaways, really, from the garden. And know if you do a water study and you dig a hole and it fills with water before you put any in, know that you have plenty of water on your site.
So Kim, back to you. Here are the wild things. So enjoy this while we're getting ready for the questions.
Okay, well, first of all, I just want to put this out there that I'm wondering if anybody, we have over 700 people here, and I'm wondering if they're thinking what I'm thinking, which is, Bobbie and Randi, will you come over? I will make you tea. Take a look.
I'll bring you Pacra Aria.
I just want to say that was amazing. It was extraordinary. And we have a ton of questions in the Q&A. So I am going to get right to it.
Great.
We will not get to all of them. We will get to as many as we can. But Heather, who is working our chat tonight, is going to post Randi and Bobbie's contact information in the chat. So if we don't get to your question, feel free to email them, and they will try to get back to you as soon as they can. So let's just get going. Let's jump right into this. I'm not asking any of my questions because there's just, I want to get right. I have your phone numbers, so I know how to do that later.
You know where we live, Kim. We're doomed.
I do. Okay, so here we go. We're going to start with Gail. How do you do an orientation of the amount of sun in your front yard?
Bobbie, do you want to take that one? So I'll start out with this. So Google Earth is my friend. And I learned this actually in a landscaping class I took at Longwood. And the teacher was awesome because he shared his secret. If someone calls up and asks him if he'd be interested in working on a project with them, the first question he asks is, give me your address. And while he's on the phone, he uses Google Earth. Google Earth gives you a compass rose, So you know whether you're facing east, west, north, south, or somewhere in between, and you can get a better sense then of what kind of sun you're going to have. Are you going to have hot afternoon sun, cooler morning sun? But using Google Earth and putting your address in there, your complete address, is a great way to start if you want to understand what kind of sun you may have in your front yard. The other thing is, like I did, I set my timer and went out every 2 hours and took a picture so that I could actually photograph and see exactly where the sun was as it moved from early in the morning to late at night. Now, I redid that this summer to see how off I really was, but it's very helpful, and it doesn't have to be every 2 hours, every 3 hours, something to give you a sense of where the sun's moving to and or from and to, I think is a good way to start. Anything you want to add to that, Randi?
No, other than the fact that when you do a proper light study like that, you can really be surprised, even when you've been living someplace for quite a long time, to discover exactly how many hours of sun that an area has. Because I grew up in the deep shade. You know, my mother lied to herself that we had this one sunny spot in the garden. We didn't have a sunny spot in the garden. It was the only place any sun hit. I suppose it was our sunniest spot. But a proper light study where you take pictures every couple of hours can really be, no pun intended, enlightening.
Okay, let's go to Kelly. Kelly wants to know, Heuchera americana is eaten by our deer. Is there another Heuchera I can try, or another similar looking native perennial?
Well, if the deer have discovered your Heuchera, then the deer are going to eat your Heuchera, and it really doesn't matter which species of Heuchera that's going to be. That is one of the ones that different deer populations tend to work on better or worse. It doesn't have the same flowers, but honestly, the golden ragwort that Bobbie has tends to be rather deer resistant. It's not perfectly deer resistant, but the deer do tend to avoid it because it does have some fragrance to the stems to it. So that you can have a similar clumping effect to that. Bobbie, do you have any other ideas offhand?
So my only experience, I actually have the straight species in pots. So I did my pots with native plants this year just as an experiment, and the deer have not touched them. And the caramel, which Randi talked about earlier, which is an H. villosa, maybe an H. villosa, the southern species, they nibble, but they don't eat like crazy. So mine's actually in pretty good shape year round.
So if you've been playing with cultivars, in other words, you might want to actually just try some straight species and see if that works better for you. I misunderstood. I thought perhaps you had already been using straight species, but that might be an option.
Suzanne would like to know, what do you think of Ptolemy's advice to be very cautious of cultivars that change the leaf color? Reds and purples won't feed the same caterpillars as the native green or flower. Can reduce or eliminate nectar and pollen. Susan, I just want to say to you, you should come to our book club on Monday night, because Dr. Randi Eckel will be back to be our special guest at that, and Heather will be posting about that in the chat. But can we jumpstart this? Dr. Eckel, what do you think?
I agree with Doug Ptolemy on that 100%. A lot of folks are very enamored of the dark foliage plants. Bobbie's got some in her landscape, but the chemical that it's produced are anthocyanins and other chemicals which help to protect the plants from herbivory, which means they're not going to feed the caterpillars, which means they're not going to do what they ought to do in the wild. You have to realize that one of the things, not only the taste of plants, but pollinators look for, they use visual cues to find flowers. And if you take the flower and change the look of it and change the color of it and change it around entirely, they may not even recognize it as the plant that they're looking for. So yes, I'm sure we'll get into that discussion at the book club on Monday.
And Randi, one other point, Mount Cuba does a lot of studies of the straight species, comparing them to cultivars. And I don't know that I've ever seen anything about them as host plants being, but it definitely as nectar and pollinator plants. So there's a lot of things if you're concerned about, are they going to attract pollinators? You can go to Mount Cuba and look up specific plants and see if they've done any studies on them. But yeah, I tried to avoid, except for my Husker Red and my Itea actually, it looks just like a normal Itea. It's just got that bright red in the fall after the caterpillars are gone. I really try to avoid changing the foliage color or choosing a cultivar that changed the foliage color, because I too read that and I believed it. I didn't know what Randi does, the science behind it, but yes.
It is worth noting that Mount Cuba is really one of the first groups to start looking at the difference, how the different cultivars are attractive to different pollinators. I don't think they're quantifying the quality or the quantity of the pollen or nectar, but they actually are now partnering with the Temple Arboretum in Pennsylvania. They're going to be taking some of those same cultivars out and testing them for deer resistance as well, because Mount Cuba does these great studies, but they're beautifully fenced. There are no deer in Mount Cuba. So they're looking at that as well.
I just want to say, Bobbie, when you took that privacy fence down, it just, whoa. I mean, it just opened everything up and it became a gardener's dream, I think.
Yes.
You know, I mean, it was just amazing, the difference. And I think everybody would agree. And at the very end, though, we might want to go back. I'd like to know what your neighbors thought of that and if they were okay with that. But before we get to that, let's go to Joanne. Joanne wants to know, how do you keep the deer from devouring your hydrangea?
A fence. Oh, I've had two issues with that side of the garden, because they're only on that one side that you can see here in the thank you. I had my neighbor knows nothing about plants, so she decided she was going to kill the weeds in her grass and started spraying on a windy day. And it destroyed so much of that side of the garden. I was heartbroken. And her comment was, I know nothing about plants. I thought it would only kill the weeds. So I've had that, but the deer, this is actually, that stake with the sun and the stake to the far right is holding deer netting, which is actually a pretty firm netting. It's not the soft like bird netting. It's a firm netting that I have attached to that about 8 feet around the garden. And frankly, it's the only way I keep the deer out, because those two are one of probably 100 that graze here in the back every single day. The deer pressure is like so high here.
Okay, Noreen, any suggestions on how to persuade neighbors? Here we go with the neighbors. Neighbors' friends to forego treating their lawns. It's so ingrained with especially older people. And it is. And this is a good topic for discussion this week, because we just had a bill passed for a neonicotinoid. Please help me out here. This should be a wordle. Neonicotinoid. Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. It's very difficult because a lot of folks have been very well, I don't want to say trained, but they've come up through this idea that, lawns should only have Kentucky bluegrass in them, which, by the way, Kentucky bluegrass isn't a native grass. It's just named to make us think that. In the early 1900s, flowers in the lawn were considered a good thing. You were sort of frowned upon if you didn't have flowers in your lawn. You should have had flowers in your lawn. And then the Masters tournament was shown on television in full color, and suddenly everybody wanted a putting green for their yard. And that's when a lot of lawn treatments, broad scale lawn treatments, really started probably in the 60s and the 70s, moving on. And now it's so ingrained in some folks, and it's very difficult. I think discussing with them why, you get what, more results, what is it, with sugar than with vinegar, or is that the phrase? Talking to them why you would like them to use less, and maybe not, you may not be able to get them to go cold turkey, but talk to them about why you're concerned about it. I think Bobbie probably had a pretty easy conversation with her neighbor who sprayed the herbicide and killed half her plants. I imagine her neighbor was horrified. But usually the results are a little more subtle than that. Bobbie, do you have any other ideas?
I would just, by example, my neighbors on the other side have 2 little kids. They're busy. They're both employed and have big corporate jobs. And there's a plot that separates our yard in the front from theirs. And they're always out there spraying the weeds and stuff. So I just went out and said, hey, Joe, I have an idea. I have this plant out back that's evergreen. It grows like crazy that I can put in there, and you'll never have to weed again. You'll never have to spray again. And he let me take all of my crazy Pachyraria and put it in there. So I put about 12 plants. They're starting to, the rhizomes are starting to reach out. I'll bet it'll be full in another year and a half, or 2 seasons. And then he asked me, what can I put on the side of my house?
Nice.
Love to have something on the side of my house. So it's really a conversation. And I'm a shy person. It may not look like it on here, but I'm a very shy person. I'm not someone that's going to go out and say, I wish you could do this, or I really think you should do that. I really am trying to influence in a very subtle, quiet way and offer to add some of my plants to their yard.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Yeah. But I think it is a conversation. I think Bobbie's absolutely right. And I think it's easier to try to convert them than simply get angry.
And you mentioned that in the very beginning, Randi. You mentioned there's the house, the real estate agent, the brokers looking at the house with all the pretty plants placed just perfectly, but that you can have these beautiful native gardens. And I think that's what that people are trying to, that we kind of need to show those real estate agents how gorgeous all of this is. I'm going to jump to Rebecca. I think this is really important. Rebecca, there is no question. She is down. She is native plant all the way. But where does she start? Where do people start? Can you give them, what are the top 5 to 10 plants that if they're just kind of starting to convert over to native plants in a butterfly garden in a wildlife habitat, what are the beginners?
I would go with plants that were deer resistant, quite frankly, because almost everybody in New Jersey has deer. So I would go with beard tongue. I would go with tall beard tongue. I would go with calico beard tongue, which allows you to get slightly pink flowers without going for a cultivar. They like very similar conditions, and they're as deer resistant as the next second is close. I would go with maybe wild bergamot, which attracts lots and lots of butterflies. I would go with one of the rudbeckias. It could be black-eyed Susan. It could be sweet black-eyed Susan. It could be brown-eyed Susan. There are lots and lots of different rudbeckias. Brown-eyed Susan, Rudbeckia fulgida, is a really nice, well-behaved garden, makes a good cut flower. It's not necessarily terribly deer resistant, but the deer don't always mow them down. But I would look to some that maybe blue false indigo. It takes a few years to get established, but it's a gorgeous plant and it's deer resistant and very, very garden worthy. One of the things that you can do depending on where you are is there are some really excellent botanical gardens out and around that have wonderful examples of both formal and less formal gardens. Longwood Garden has some beautiful ones. Mount Cuba has some beautiful ones. I don't know how far everyone.
How about Bowman's Hill?
Bowman's Hill over in nearby Pennsylvania. If anybody's on has any access or ever goes to Southern Delaware, the new Delaware Botanic Gardens at Pepper Creek, which I haven't been to yet because they came live during COVID, but they are fabulous. I've seen a lot of pictures and it's definitely on my list of places to go back to. So sometimes it's really nice to be able to go to some of these example gardens where they've done really great things with native plants and steal some ideas. You know, it's we don't need to always reinvent the wheel. We can see what other people's wheels look like and put them in our garden.
And Randi, I would also say, don't forget your soil test, don't forget your drainage test, and don't forget the sun study, because
Absolutely.
you can't put the right plant in the right place unless you know those things first.
Absolutely.
Well, I wish we could keep going all night, but we can't. We have to wrap this up. Can you take a few more? Maybe
Sure.
like 2 or 3 more questions before we
Sure.
say goodnight?
Are we good with that, Bobbie?
Yep.
All right.
So then I'm gonna jump into, there's so many good ones. How do you go about convincing longtime gardeners? This happened to me this past summer. I got rid of my butterfly bush and I put in a button bush. How do you go about, it was because Randi convinced me. But how do you go about convincing longtime gardeners that things like butterfly bush and spirea are in fact bad choices?
Well, there are native spireas, which are perfectly good choices. You're probably talking about Japanese spirea, which
Possibly.
is,
The question is from Nick, so it could possibly be.
so it's, again, it's a conversation. One of the things that I find that explaining to people why invasive plants are a problem, I think can go a long way, and explaining where you've seen the invasive plants. Because an invasive plant, it's aggressive, it moves out into the wild, it's non-native, so our wildlife can't use it in any functional way. So it's basically taking up space where we should be producing birds and butterflies and beetles and other interesting creatures. I've actually talked to some yard care folks who very amusingly have told me that the homeowners that they work for don't believe that butterfly bush is invasive. He says, no, because my crew is yanking out all the butterfly bushes that are coming up off their property that are seeding in from the butterfly bushes that they have. So the homeowner doesn't see that it's invasive, that it's seeding in, because their gardeners are pulling out all the weeds. But it is, again, it's a conversation. Bobbie, do you have any other brilliant ideas or better suggestions on how to start that conversation?
I plant it in your yard, show them how beautiful it is, and it would be worth them planting it too. That's all I can say.
Yeah. I think what you were talking about before, Kim, is that we need to lead by example and show how you can do a beautiful landscape using natives. You know, one of my bad jokes about butterfly bush is you might as well just put out colorful sponges with sugar water in them, because at least they're not invasive and they would do just as good. But you know, that's not really most folks' aesthetic.
Okay, here's a question from John. Is there an advantage to planting New Jersey natives rather than natives which don't naturally grow in New Jersey? So I think this is a great question, because we've heard northeastern natives and, you know, can you talk about that a little bit, especially for people who are just beginning?
Sure, Bobbie, do you want to talk about that, or you want me to take that one?
I think your scientific knowledge would be good. I have an opinion, but I think having a more scientific perspective would be helpful.
So filling your garden with, it's a complex question actually, but you know, the short list is native to your state is always going to be better than native to your region, which is going to be better than simply native to North America, which is always going to be better than native to overseas. But with global warming, there's actually a lot of debate about what's exactly native. Plants don't pay any attention to political boundaries, quite frankly. So, you know, if you're in northern New Jersey, if you're in Essex and Hudson County, you know, is it native to New Jersey or is it native to nearby New York? Well, it's sort of the plants don't really care where the state line is. So it is always best for the wildlife in your area for them to use and have access to plants that they co-evolved with. You know, if you're planting plants from your ecoregion, which is a big word, but if you Google it, you can see beautiful ecoregion maps which show where similar areas of similar conditions come together. It's really more important than state boundaries. Looking to other plants that are native to your ecoregion or adjoining ecoregions. Having said that, you know, plants that are native in California, but don't come out of California, they're not native here. You might as well plant something Japanese, quite frankly, if you're going that far afield. Did that answer make any sense? I felt like I just combined one of my entire lectures into a sentence and a half, and I'm not sure it worked.
No, I think it did. I think we should have you back for another webinar just to talk about that.
Okay.
Okay, Bobbie, I'm going to throw this final question out to you.
Good.
What did your neighbors, how did they react to your work? This question is from Carol.
Actually, it's very interesting. So on the one side, I don't think they care because they don't get it, you know, and she's the one that sprayed and she felt horrible. So I think she's now sequestered in her home forever because she doesn't want to destroy anything or hurt anything on my property because we get along beautifully. The other side, they're outside a lot. They've got 2 little kids. The wife's father actually is a gardener. Actually, he grows his own grapevines in the backyard, and he's very interested in what I'm doing. And every time they're over in the spring, summer, or fall, when it's a nice day, he's sitting in the back enjoying my yard. Now, we also have people who walk, lots of people walk in this neighborhood, dog walkers, regular walkers, all of that. Had several folks that aren't even immediate neighbors say, what the heck are you doing back there? What is that I see back there? So my husband, who's the mayor, and not really, but he sits on the front porch in his executive office in the good weather. And he tells them, look, my wife is home. You want me to ask her to come out and show you around? So I've shown quite a few neighbors around in the backyard. And some of them have actually asked me, what could I plant? So it's been kind of fun that way. It's been very positive. And I think because I was aware of creating an aesthetic that could be appealing in a neighborhood that's very static from their landscape point of view. And even though my landscape looks different, it's not totally out of the box, you know? So I was cognizant of that from the beginning.
Well, it looks great, Bobbie. You've done a fabulous job in your garden.
Thank you, Randi. That means a lot.
Amazing. So, okay, well, I wish we could get to all of these. We've had over 700 people sign up, and no, we had over 1,000 people sign up. Over almost 800 people were here tonight.
Wow. Thank you for joining us.
Do you have anything, any wrap up, any final comments?
No, but I'm happy to answer questions. I may not get to them tomorrow. So if you use my email, just send me a note.
Okay.
I'm happy to answer whatever questions. I saw a bunch of people signing up for my Instagram account. Thank you. And I'll keep that fresh.
Good.
Because we know she takes good pictures. So yeah. And you know, anybody can email me, of course, with any questions. I'll try to get back to them as soon as possible. My email's up there as well. But I really want to thank everyone for coming by. Bobbie did such a fabulous job of documenting what she did in 3 years. It was really a joy to work on this presentation.
Well,
And
thanks, Randi.
would it be okay if I mention that, you know, again, that you are the founder of Toadshade Wildflower Farm, and if you want to mail order, because it is really hard. I know we live in Jersey City, and it is at least an hour drive to go get native plants that haven't been treated with, you know, pesticides or insecticides. So we bought a lot of stuff from Toadshade, and I hope it's okay to throw it out there, people. Toadshade Wildflower Farm. Order your seeds, order some of your starter plants. And thank you both so much. This has just been a really wonderful way to start off this new webinar season. And And if you want to see Dr. Eckel on Monday night, please join us for our book club. Just write to Hudson at NPSNJ.org, put book club in the subject, and we'll send you information on that. And Bobbie, I know you're such a big, huge Doug Ptolemy fan, so I hope you will come.
Thank you. And one more plug for Toadshade. They actually have a deer resistant filter. So go there and find your plants.
All right. Well, then with that, I'm going to say good night, everybody. Join us for Jay Alvarez in February. Go to npsnj.org, and under events, you'll see everything that's coming up. And we've got plant sales and all kinds of great stuff. So renew that membership. Okay. Good night,
Awesome.
Bob. Good night, Randi.
Thank you, Kim, so much for hosting.
Thank you all. Good night.